Wonderful. We will make a start. Jack will be presenting Edmund Burke to begin with, and then we'll be moving on to romantic poets. Jack will give an introduction about Burke, and I will give an introduction about the poets. And yeah, thank you all for attending this session of our Heritage Reading Club. Do we have anything else that we want to announce?
Only that the next session is
2 weeks' time.
2 weeks' time on Oakshott primarily.
Perfect.
But we can talk about that at the end.
I'm a final year PhD candidate now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
now
officially?
that the new term has started, I've had my tutorial, so yeah, cheers to that.
That guaranteed final year, or hopefully final year.
Yes, hopefully, with many edits, I'm sure, but as it stands, on track for it. So yeah, wonderful. And yeah, with that celebration over, let's.
You've got to bring your paper at some point.
Oh yes, well exactly. Yeah.
Discuss it and tear it apart.
I certainly would. Yeah, no, it would. It really would. And particularly around revolution, but we can discuss that further in terms of the Glorious Revolution. But yeah,
which is a subject tonight,
so,
maybe. Yeah.
Wonderful. So, let's crack on.
Yeah. So we had this idea of pooling together Edmund Burke and Romanticism, which I don't know if that seems a bit counterintuitive to people. I don't know what your immediate thoughts about that are. I'm quite interested to know.
I don't know. I don't know much about Romanticism.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
I'm happy.
What comes to mind when we think of Romanticism for you all?
Dating.
Oh right.
Really?
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Apart from going, it sounds like a strange mix.
Yeah. Okay. So I think it basically goes back to this philosopher Rousseau, French philosopher. We studied him in our first series on liberty. With the very first thinker we did, he had this idea about the social contract, the state of nature of man being something where the morals are pure because the desires are very simple. And he had a critique of politics that sort of built on that, because society seems to complicate our desires, introduce unnecessary desires, and thereby corrupt man. So that's Rousseau. That's sort of the founding doctrine of Romanticism. So, but so is
it based on the idea that man is fundamentally good then?
Yes,
as
indeed.
opposed to man is fundamentally bad.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
That's useful.
So that's a core tenet. Also, it later develops into an emphasis on the individual and individuals coming together. Hi, Joe. How are you doing? We just started. I'm just giving an introduction on Romanticism.
Great.
So, yeah, there's a lot of emphasis there on the individual, on how a society is just individuals coming together in a voluntary way. Rousseau had this famous line about man being born free, but everywhere he's in chains. This is his view of social institutions and culture, basically. But then later on, you get people like William Wordsworth, a poet, a romantic poet. Why is he romantic? Not because he's writing about love, but because he's writing about nature and because he's writing about very ordinary and simple people. But then you also have other romantic poets like Byron, who we'll look at. And Byron is a great sort of nationalist figure, and so it's not quite the same sentiment as Wordsworth, I would say. And so the question that comes to my mind is, are there multiple ideas of Romanticism at play? And this is why I wanted to have a little look at Edmund Burke, because he's not someone I would automatically associate, except his language sort of falls into this tradition a little bit, despite the fact he really does oppose himself to the social contract series of Rousseau and others. So I'll give a quick introduction. Do I have to click the...
Yes, sorry, Jack. Someone's just asking for the reading, so I'm just trying to send them the link.
I'll just step up every time I need to read it.
Oh no, don't you worry, I can be your assistant.
So he's Edmund Burke. He's basically regarded as call it the founding father of modern European conservatism. And with this book, the reflections on the revolution in France, which is that statement. Why is it called that? It's written as a letter to a friend in France after the revolution, but he makes it a public letter because he wants to address the English politicians on this subject as well. We'll talk a bit about that in a moment. He's raised by a Catholic mother and a Protestant father in Dublin, but he follows in his father's and he takes that very seriously all his life. He's very instructive on the theme of whether Burke has a foot in the Romantic tradition at least. It's called A Vindication of Natural Society this phrase natural society is quite curious, and he argues that he basically argues in favour of hereditary government there, which is like monarchy, for example, would be one form of hereditary government, in contrast with the social contract theory. There were writers who were criticising religion as being irrational because it wasn't constructed on a rational system. So that was a very enlightened idea. And Burke observed, well, if that's the case, then also you have to get rid of the hereditary governments, which is what his name is, natural society refers to. These organic societies that are formed according to tradition and long period of time and sort of unspoken changes and offices being created and so forth, almost lost to the annals of history. We don't quite know where they emerged from in all cases. This is clearly an irrational society by the Enlightenment standard, yet it's something that Burke wants to defend. Shortly after this, and only at the age of 24, he writes also very well-known treatise on ascetics called, I don't remember the full title, do I even have it? Oh yeah, A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful. He writes it to criticise the old Platonist concept of beauty being about proportion. And he talks a lot there about this other kind of beauty, the sublime, which is when we're in awe of things, when we feel great awe or terror at the immensity of something. Like, you know, imagine like a great like German symphony or something, and you sort of, you know, it washes over you. That kind of beauty. It's not beauty in the conventional sense. It's not nice. It's not smooth. It's something else. So he talks a lot about that. On the basis of that, he got invited to London. He got to edit a journal called the Annual Register on international affairs. He became a pamphleteer to the Whig Party, which was those days, I think, the Conservative Party sort of equivalent. He wrote on various controversies of the day, including the American Revolution, limiting powers of British monarchs, and also there was a lot of controversy over the East India Trading Company and whoever was running that at the time. He led, if I remember correctly, he led a litigation against this guy, but then that guy was vindicated and so it was a bit backfired a little bit, but he was a bit of a controversial and corrupt figure. He was also MP for Malton, near York, where I studied, so he had a personal interest, and then in Bristol, near to us. If you could move to the slide, that'd be wonderful. Okay, so this book, The Reflection on the Revolution, he time in France very well. He had a lifelong interest in the other France, and I guess he was in his 40s when that revolution broke out in 1789, and one of his friends wrote to him about this and gave him sort of, and he wrote an initial letter in response. Then he wrote this second one, and the motive for writing this second and much more lengthy letter, maybe 150 pages or something, is because the Whig Party had got it in their head that what had happened in the revolution in France was exactly what they wanted to happen here in England. They saw what happened in France with the overthrow of the monarch and the institution of the republic to be the logical conclusion of the events of the glorious revolution of 1688, and that's the time when we deposed King James II and invited the Protestant king over to rule us in his stead. And so the Whigs were saying this is, you know, evidence that we can sort of do without the monarchy. But Burke, and this has become very characteristic of his doctrinal conservatism, says no. What actually happened there was the working and functional parts of our state worked in a lawful way, in a constitutional way, to rectify the degenerate parts of the state, namely the monarch himself. And it's just the network reconnecting. If we could, next slide. we talked a bit in another Burke and Thomas Paine. So Thomas Paine was the young sort of Enlightenment rationalist who went over to America and had a lot of correspondence with George Washington and a lot of people who were founding the republics there, and also in France. And he was very critical of Burke. He said, does Mr. Burke really mean to say that a man has no rights? That was Thomas Paine's interpretation of Burke, particularly the line where Burke writes that the nation, meaning us, did at the revolution of the glory solemnly abdicate their right for themselves and for all their posterity forever to elect their sovereign. That was the critical issue. Can we elect our kings? That was the dispute. But Paine thought that meant we sacrificed all of our rights.
And is Mr. Burke not a man also? As he slammed on the table.
It's an incredible letter. It's like 10 pages. It's worth reading. It's Paine's letter to George Washington.
And I think if you watch a version of Beyond the Text, our podcast, you see a beautiful rendition of it.
Truly. And we had a lovely debate. I sort of took the position of Burke, sort of where my natural sensibilities lie.
Passionate Burkean and a reluctant Painist.
A reluctant Painist. That was it. Okay, so now, I think it's worth pointing out that Burke would not deny that there are rights, which it would be intrinsically unjust for a state to fail to uphold. Moreover, Burke's support for the American Revolution shows that he's actually not opposed to men abandoning one state and establishing another, but the issue is precisely whether citizens have the right to radically revise the foundation of their society, since it's operated with time immemorial. Burke is essentially advocating society as an intergenerational project. That's the question. And do you have the right to break the chain? Does anyone have the right to break the chain? How would you understand that? That's the that particular issue is what I wanted to begin by reflecting on with a few excerpts, if I could. I want to explore in particular whether we do detect some undertones of the kind of romanticism I described at the beginning, or if this is something quite new. I think there are parallels but also radical differences. I'll read it out and then we can discuss it together. We, the English, are not the converts of Rousseau. We are not the disciples of Voltaire. Servatius has made no progress among us. Atheists are not our preachers, madmen not our lawgivers. We know that we have made no discoveries, and we think that no discoveries are to be made. Immorality, nor many in the great principles of government, nor in the ideas of liberty, which were well understood long before we were born. Altogether, as well as they will be after the grave has heaped its mould upon our presumption, and the silent tomb shall have imposed its law on our loquacity. We fear God, we look up to all his kings, with affection to parliament, with duty to magistrates, with reverence to priests, and with respect to nobility. But why? Because when such ideas are brought before our mind, it is natural to be so affected. That's an interesting word. It's natural to be so affected. Because all other feelings are false and spurious and tend to corrupt our minds, to vitiate our primary morals, also another interesting phrase, to render us unfit for rational liberty, and by teaching us a servile, licentious, and abandoned insolence to be our low sport for a few holidays, to make us perfectly fit for and justly deserving of slavery through the whole course of our lives. Very strong statement.
Yes, rather potent.
Indeed. Does anyone recognise traces of romanticism in that? Or is this something radically opposed to Rousseau? Indeed, let me explain why I've raised this question. Yes, he begins, we are not the converts of Rousseau. But he talks about, he justifies a lot of the attitude toward monarchic, toward monarchy and toward a lot of the traditional aspects of society as part of natural affection and primary morals.
And I would say when we're looking at sort of the context of Burke, again, this comes back to sort of some of the things we were saying last week, but this is at a time of scientization. I mean, the Rousseau point sort of slightly confuses things in a sense, because although Rousseau wouldn't have been seen as a romantic by Burke, as Jack was saying earlier, Rousseau is seen as a proto-romantic, at least in the canon. Yeah. But in terms of these kind of new secular political interpretations that are coming from France, Burke is saying, well, this is actually not something natural. The natural evolution of the state is something that has been built up layer by layer, brick by brick, to the point in history at which Burke is writing, and he's saying that this natural evolution of the state, this natural evolution of the way of things, is being swept away by one single generation of thinkers, of writers, of political figures who are suddenly saying, actually, no, this isn't correct. Now, for some of us who live in the trend of the Enlightenment, we think, well, surely analysing things with reason, with the methods of science that we can transpose into the political science, we kind of think, oh, well, that's surely natural because we're analysing things with our rational faculties and trying to implement a system of government that is rational. And that would be the Enlightenment argument. What Burke is saying is doing that is actually doing away with the natural, because it's radically knocking down a wall that has been built up slowly, carefully, layer upon layer, up until this point. And that is the natural progression of a polity, not to wipe that all away with one swoop.
But also, is it saying that what you wipe it away with, you shouldn't just make it up and then do it? I mean, because as you say, scientization is taking place, so new theories, new ideologies are coming up, and if people are caught up in those new ideas, then without actually, what we say, testing them, testing those grounds, if you just sweep things away and replace them, and then you find actually
it doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
Yeah.
So rather than going through that catastrophic approach,
you need to do it.
Maybe tweak the direction a bit.
Yeah.
But do it steadily and carefully and empirically.
Exactly, and you make a fantastic point, Bruce, because the other historiographical debate amongst intellectual historians, political theorists, is that surely counter-Enlightenment scholars, who are often seen as the precursors to the Romantics, including Burke, technically including Rousseau in an awkward way, but counter-Enlightenment and Enlightenment are artificial concepts that we've created to encompass these figures. Burke is using exactly the same mindset, exactly the same tools of his day to analyse the political system that Enlightenment scholars, who are then being summoned by French revolutionaries to destroy the French state and rebuild it in their image, they're also calling and using the same tools that Burke is using to analyse the state. They're just both coming to different ends. And why is that, Jack? Because we're bricoleurs. Because all of these philosophers are bricoleurs using the tools of their day, and that is a context, a paradigm of scientization, of logic, of reason. And Burke is using that as well, even if he is counter-Enlightenment, but he's coming to a different conclusion. Steadily, you don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but steadily look at individual issues that are wrong, amend them, make changes, but it doesn't have to be one great crashing, tumbling down of this kind of wall analogy of kind of the state being built up.
How does he defend against vested interests simply not making changes that are right for society? What is
in terms of them dominating the kind of political decision?
So this idea of bringing new ideas and reinvent society overnight sounds soft, and later communism demonstrates why. But it also is an argument for entrenched interest to maintain their.
And the Royal Charter that gave the East India Company so much authority, as Jack said, is an example of where Burke feels that democracy can try and remedy vested interest issues. As Jack said, he does try and take the EIC to court and tries to sue them. Ultimately, it's to no avail, so it proves it wrong. But he is a believer that the democratic process, if enshrined and entrenched, he would be a believer when it comes to colonial reform in something like the Durham Report in Canada and the kind of reform of the Canadian system in that way. That would be something that really comes out. Burke's not alive to see that, but comes out of a Burkean sense of we can reform it by legislating, trying to look at what the issues in part of the colonies are, and then move forward from there rather than just abandon those colonies, so to speak. Very much an evolutionary process of change.
Oh no, sorry. Indeed, I think also to address your question, Bruce, I think it has a lot to do with, like, for Burke, it's a moral problem more than it's a technical problem or a political a problem for political science. You see here, he says, we fear God, we look up to awe with kings, with affection to parliament, with duty to magistrates, with reverence to priests, and respect to nobility, because it's natural to be so affected, because all other feelings are false and spurious and tend to corrupt our minds, to vitiate our primary morals, to render us unfit for rational liberty. So he's connecting freedom to reverence for the constitution of the state, but that's not just us, the lower participants of the state, as we'll go on to see. Perhaps if we move on to the next slide.
It must also be remembered, sorry, while I get this back up, it must also be remembered that, and this is my area of expertise when it comes to this period, but it must also be remembered that Burke is writing in an era of what we call, I've mentioned it before, Bruce, in various sessions that we've done before, that this is an era of declinism, the idea that Europe, but in particular for Burke, England stands on a precipice of falling like Rome had. All of these Enlightenment scholars are reading about the ancient world, and they're thinking, if there is a sudden change, if there is a sudden loss of morals, loss of kind of the virtues that have been built up through centuries of civilization, that if it goes to licentiousness, to this level of corruption, this is a milieu, a kind of intellectual milieu in the 1720s, 30s, 40s, people that I write about, John Brown, with the estimate on manners and morals, are all saying we could go the same way as Rome. They're looking to France and seeing what's happening there. You've got I can't remember the bishop, but in France there's a conspiracy that the Enlightenment philosophers of Rousseau, Voltaire, had all conspired in a sort of formalized sense to destroy France, and this conspiracy was put about during the sort of French Revolutionary period to suggest that there was this philosopher's coup that had been sort of masterminded and planned by intellectuals that would bring down France as a nation. So declinism is very much what Burke is in the context of, and is trying to sort of ward against the possibility of that decline.
Yeah. Okay, and part of that, I think, if this first paragraph here, just on the slide, if I've gone over this, all persons possessing any portion of power ought to be strongly and awfully impressed with an idea that they act in trust, that they are to account for their conduct in that trust to the one great master, author, and founder of society. So this is the trust element, the reverence element is supposed to be entirely diffusive. Something I should have mentioned in my introduction, actually, to maybe help frame this discussion a bit better, is Rousseau finds his intellectual opposite in a later German thing. I would argue, correct me if anyone disagrees, his later intellectual opposite in a figure called Hegel. And I say this because Rousseau has a lot of contempt for sort of the growth of society into complexity, and a much more emphasis on the individual. This guy Hegel, who I will try and keep a very simple figure for the sake of this discussion, very much has the kind of reverence for monarchy, and sort of believes that the individual is very much subservient to the state insofar as monarchy is the ideal. And the whole tradition of German romanticism comes from that idea, I would argue. So you've got sort of a pull there, and I see a lot of elements of this in Burke, this reverence for this sacralizing of the state, the sacralizing of tradition, and that's supposed to be the regulative principle against corruption, if we can all form ourselves to understand that and to be attentive to that. Obviously, he's not so naive that that's an easy thing, because he's battling this all around him. Then he goes on to say something which I find quite peculiar, and I might read a little bit more from the book. Try and understand it. Let's see. Let me read a bit from the book to contextualize the middle paragraph. This consecration of the state by a state, a religious establishment, is necessary also to operate with a wholesome awe upon free citizens, because in order to secure their freedom they must enjoy some determinate portion of power. To them, therefore, a religion connected with the state, and with their duty towards it, becomes even more necessary than in such societies where the people, by terms of their subjection, are confined to private sentiments and the management of their own family concerns. All persons possessing any portion of power ought to be strongly and awfully impressed with an idea that they act in trust, and that they are to account for their conduct in that trust to the one great master, author, and founder of society. That's sort of where that top one ends. And he goes on to say the principle ought even to be more strongly impressed upon the mind of those who compose the collective sovereignty than oppose those of single princes. Without instruments, these princes can do nothing. Whoever uses instruments in finding helps finds also impediments. Their power is therefore by no means complete, nor are they safe in extreme abuse. Such persons, however elevated by flattery, arrogance, and self-opinion, must be sensible that, whether covered or not by positive law, in some way or other, they are accountable even here, for the abuse of their trust. If they are not cut off by rebellion of their people, they may be strangled by the very janissaries kept for their security against all other rebellion. Thus have we seen the King of France sold by his soldiers for an increase of pay. But where popular authority is absolute and unrestrained, the people have an infinitely greater, because a far better founded confidence in their own power. They are themselves in great measure their own instruments. They are nearer to their objects. Besides, they are less under responsibility to one of the greatest controlling powers on earth, the sense of fame and estimation. And it goes on. What I find curious, and even I struggle to understand in this stage of his argument, and this is summarised in the central paragraph on the board there, where popular authority is absolute and unrestrained, the people have an infinitely greater, because a far better founded confidence in their own power. Seems to be a bit of a paradox, and I wonder how we ought to understand it.
I was trying to gather that, because surely if you've got a group of people all acting in a particular direction, usually they've got some leader anyway, who's therefore like the prince below.
Yes.
Otherwise, they'd be so chaotic, they wouldn't carry out much action but concerted effort. I don't know, I'm struggling to understand how each individual go, we're all just going to attack that wall all at the same time. We all want to usually be one person in charge, go, let's attack that way. And in which case, they do have a leader after all. It's not so much just like one common mind.
I just say it feels like the Hobbesian thing. Without the state, we descend into chaos, and with the chaos, life is a nasty British short. So we're better off having someone who holds it all together. So state power.
Yeah.
Which is what you're saying. So,
I think it also helps to think about the paradox of representation. So the distinguishing feature of representative democracy is that representatives do things which the people who vote for them don't want them to do, right? Because otherwise it wouldn't be representative democracy, it would just be a sort of direct democracy, because the will of the person who's the representative is exactly the same as the people who've voted for them in some way. And that's kind of the situation he's talking about. You know, it's not a representative democracy where the sort of mob gets together and chooses someone, and that person says, okay, I'm going to act according to what I think is prudent, and as I'm a representative, I have this sovereignty which derives from the people. Rather, it's a situation, as you can imagine during the Terror in the French Revolution, where someone says, okay, I want to kill that person, I'm doing it, it's the will of the people, and then you get a mob to scream about it, and that's your legitimacy. And all those people want that person to die, so there is a sense. But of course, if that mob then decides that the person who's ordered the execution should die, that person will end up on the guillotine. Because there isn't a sense of, wait a minute, we have a constitution, and therefore the person who has authority is the person who's in charge of us, who we've elected, rather than us ourselves. And
that actually suggests that the person who we elect shouldn't always do what we want them to do, and indeed they don't. So because sometimes we, the baying mob, we'll want them to, I don't know, kick out Keir Starmer, sack whoever, and for the sake of the Constitution, for the sake of continuity and retaining popular authority, they should not do that. So there's a balance between what the will of the individuals are, which is never a singular thing anyway. It's always an amalgam of conflicting wills, and the will that they should express in their role.
Yeah, I mean, I think Burke writes about it a bit strangely, because he sort of reifies the people as if the people actually are choosing one thing. But actually, as you say, it's chaotic, right? It's a particular group of people in a particular place who exert their popular authority as a mob, as a crowd of people, I mean, and it's I can't remember what the statistic is, but if you will say you have 1.5% or 2% of the population of a state go out and protest the bad government will fall. If they actually physically present, you have in Tahrir Square in Egypt, you have 1 million people. That's enough in a country of 100 million people for the government not to be able to survive. But in that situation, of course, it seems like the popular authority is a real thing. And he's not really talking about how this is a mirage, but he does talk later on about how, he's talking about it, but you have to, where is it?
Let me know the page number.
There's this bit where he talks about magistrates and how, it's not enough to be, for the magistrates to respect the people also need to respect the magistrates. And I think that kind of clarifies this point about popular authority.
I've got to say, I think it's a fascinating topic with regard to America and where it is today. And the respect for the various institutions, the division of power, what do we call it? Separation of
power,
separation of power,
checks and balances.
But also how the people are maybe vote believing one thing to elect somebody who will go and do something very different, and will rationalise it back to them later on. And this would have gone on in Burke's day when they had the conflict between did they represent their constituents, or were they simply having been elected, they were now free to decide what they wanted to vote for.
Yeah, whether they were representatives or sort of delegate versus representative model of democracy. I would also say that the idea that there's a framework also means that you can single out, going back to my wall analogy with Burke, you can single out the rotten brick. So you can say, as you were saying, about the judiciary, for example, you can say, well, is there an issue there with the judiciary? Is there an issue economically? If you remove all the bricks, you start from a point of going, well, something could be wrong, but everything could be wrong. If you have a framework for Burke, you can say, well, infrastructure in the country is wrong and we need to focus on that, or the economy is going X, Y, or Z way, and you can focus on that and try and remedy that. You can focus on the rotten element of what is causing an issue within your polity. Whereas if you knock it all down, you don't know which one was fundamentally the cause of your woe. For Burke, okay.
Just to read the last paragraph on this, perhaps just give something of a coherent summary of the paradox Jerome mentioned. But one of the first and most leading principles on which the Commonwealth and the laws are consecrated is lest the temporary possessors and life renters in it, unmindful of what they have received from their ancestors or of what is due to their posterity, should act as if they were entire masters of it. And first of all, the science of jurisprudence, the pride of the human intellect, which, with all its defects, redundancies, and errors, is a collected region of ages, combines the principles of original justice with the infinite variety of human concerns. The heap of old exploded errors would no longer be studied. Personal self-sufficiency and arrogance would usurp the tribunal. It goes on to say, thank you, Sam, to avoid, therefore, the evils of inconstancy and versatility, 10,000 times worse than those of obstinacy and the blighter's prejudice, we have consecrated the state that no man should approach to look into its defects or corruption, but with due caution. That he should never dream of beginning its reformation with its subversion. That he should approach to the faults of the state, not to the wounds of his father, who was pious awe and reverence. And finally, underlining this is his thesis with regard to the social contract. He says, society is indeed a contract. Subordinate contracts for objects of mere occasional interest may be dissolved at pleasure, but the state ought not to be considered as nothing better than a partnership, agreement in a trade of pepper and coffee, and to be dissolved by the fancy of the parties. It is to be looked on with other reverence, because it is not a partnership in things subservient only to the gross animal existence of a temporary and perishable nature. It is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue and in all perfection. As the ends of such a partnership cannot be obtained in many generations, it becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. The municipal corporations of that universal kingdom are not morally at liberty at their pleasure. I think I've maybe mistyped there. And on their speculations of a contingent improvement wholly to separate and tear asunder the bounds of their subordinate community and to dissolve it into unsocial and civil, unconnected, chaotic, elementary particles. So in some sense, as you were saying, Jerome, the authority transcends the aggregate of voices, as it were. And this is indeed the paradox of a representational democracy, and something Burke seeks to remind us of in quite a powerful way.
I'd say that this might just be me. I'm not a Burke scholar, but I'd say that the choice of phrase when he's talking about ultimately society is nothing more than essentially economic partnerships is an odd thing for someone who's trying to argue against talking about consider there's nothing better than a partnership agreement in trade or pepper or coffee. He's basically saying that the social contract is a layer upon layer of kind of mutual agreements that are formalized. I would say that that's quite an odd thing for someone who's trying to make, as we've been saying, a romantic argument about the state and about and again this comes back to your point, Bruce, and your sort of general area in terms of the idea that Burke is very much an Enlightenment figure whilst being a kind of romantic, so to speak, in the sense that he's essentially making an argument that Mandeville's already made, that Adam Smith will go on to make in the next couple of decades, that ultimately the state is just a form of kind of interrelationship through trade and sort of making these agreements with one another, and thereby he's sort of building up from that and saying that the social and this, you get this in lots of social contract theorists, that you start with a kind of basic contract and that becomes the polity through a layer of contracts. But it's an odd thing, I would say. That feels quite odd amongst the rest.
I'm not sure I understand your objection. You find it strange that he's compared the society to pepper and coffee trade, but that's what he's opposing, right? So
subordinate contracts for objects of mere occasional interest may be dissolved at pleasure, but the state ought not to be considered as nothing better than a partnership agreement in trade or pepper or coffee.
Yes, ultimately to be dissolved by the mere fancy of the parties. It is to be looked on with other reverence, but not a partnership in things subservient, but in all science, all art, every virtue and all perfection. So the romantic element comes in there.
I
do you think the beginning is
I think it sits oddly with the general argument. And 2 points I was going to make as well in terms of context is, one, obviously the Whigs never do institute a policy of republicanism. They actually end up kicking out their Republican elements, because both the Tories have what are called the high flyers who are kicked out by the Tories, and the Whigs have their kind of good old cause English Civil War kind of sort of romantics, in a sense, in their camp, who are looking back to the English Civil War and things. Ultimately, those two are kicked out. So in one sense, this isn't me criticising Burke, Jack. Well, no, it is. But he is wrong in that sense. He is also wrong in the sense that France does not actually fall into a perpetual generation of anarchy. It's very swiftly returned to a structured, essentially monarchical system under Napoleon. These Caesar figures come and sweep away the anarchy.
But that's not to be understood on the principles of the revolution, I don't think. I think that's an independent
But it comes from it.
It's a response to it. It doesn't come from it, the response to it, I would say.
Structure is restored. And the idea that, certainly, but in a new iteration that many, Napoleon files would see as actually an improved monarchy on the prior monarchy.
Well, so what's interesting is the partnerships, and not partnerships between the monarch and the people. It feels, the way it's written, there's partnerships between the people, between a person and all the other people.
Yes.
So actually, the monarch sits atop it.
Yes.
Rather than designing or defining it. And I guess when the monarchy in France is restored, are all those individual relationships and those legacies that were abandoned for a while, are they restored, or is it just a monarchy?
I'd say that through the Napoleonic era, much of the structure of which Burke is advocating is restored in many ways. I'm not so much talking about the Bourbon restoration in the sense of when the monarchy come back, but just the fact that there is a Caesar figure like Napoleon who does restore order, restores structure, and essentially an idea of what France was, but in a slightly iterated way.
Restoring order is not restoring the old regime.
No, but I'm essentially saying that much of that is restored in many ways, but for the French revolutionaries, they would see it as Napoleon has restored it to that, but actually brought stuff from the revolution that has changed society in a certain direction, but hasn't actually lost the essence of what France is. So the point I'm trying to make is neither England nor France fall into a perpetual state of anarchy. Don't fall into a perpetual state of kind of...
I guess you could see it, to the contrary, but France had the same political system at least from the 16th century to the Revolution, and you could argue all the way back, continuity all the way back through the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
In the recent period, since the Revolution, France has not had a single form of government, a constitution which lasted longer than a long human lifetime.
Exactly, indeed.
The longest lasting French, is the First and the Fifth Republics, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And England has actually retained the same constitutional structure with a few modifications, and, relatively small significance, I would say, since the time of the Revolution. So I think it's hard to say just because, of course, you can't have it's sort of nature pouring a vacuum, right? You can't have a power vacuum because it's too advantageous for someone to take advantage of it. But what France had before was something different than just having someone in power. It had a traditional form of government which was known to everyone from generation to generation.
Yes, yeah.
And that's, I think, what Burke is more concerned about. Because in the end, the English constitution has also had its hiccups, right? It's had Cromwell, it's had, the Tudors, it's had Henry the Fourth. It's not that it's been seamless, but I don't think that lack of seamlessness bothers him. I think he appreciates that things happen in history.
Yeah.
But I think he sees something new and dangerous in what's happening in France, because what they're trying to do is dissolve that generational order.
Yes, and linkage between generations.
Which isn't necessarily, disrupted just by someone taking over the state and doing something slightly differently ideologically or practically in terms of how the state is managed. It's Burke sees what's happening in France as being more radical.
Yeah. No, I suppose his view of chaos, though, is what I'm trying to say, just doesn't become a reality in the sense of just perpetual chaos. It doesn't happen in England, and it doesn't happen in the sense of kind of there is no government in France. This is the fear that by sweeping away these underlying sort of superstructures of states, you're going to lose any essence of kind of, some kind of way of governing, and that definitely does not happen in England. Even with a kind of progressive kind of liberalisation, so to speak, of the kind of constitution, as you say, not fundamentally changing, but it doesn't happen there. And in France, there is a certain element of kind of these kind of underlying superstructures being restored relatively swiftly, to be honest, as much as we say, the republics might obviously vary, but it's not like France breaks into multiple small states, for example, which is something that could have happened.
Yeah, that's remarkable.
And a certain sense of authority and power and structure is maintained throughout the period.
The question is whether that's consequent or incidental to the intention of the revolution. We can continue this discussion later.
Yes,
I would quite like to. But we spent a lot of time on Burke, and we did say we would talk about some poets.
Oh, wonderful.
Now, I suggest we just skip straight to the slide on Byron, and we can go from there.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe you'd like to tell us a little bit about Byron.
Yeah, we'll just quickly go through the Greek War of Independence. So Byron, obviously, an English poet, left England particularly unwell. He wasn't a particularly virtuous character in and of himself. Had engaged in multiple sordid activities with none other than his own sister. So we're not talking an upstanding gentleman, but he certainly was upstanding when it came to Greece, and he had a love for the nation of Greece against Ottoman rule. So the Greek War of Independence between 1821 and 1830, it was a landmark moment in 19th century nationalism and liberal thought as Greeks rose against 4 centuries of Ottoman rule. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals and romantic nationalism, the revolution began on the 25th of March in 1821 and gained early momentum despite brutal Ottoman reprisals, such as the Chios massacre in 1822, which killed an estimated 20,000 Greeks. The conflict captured the imagination of Europe, becoming a cause célèbre among liberal intellectuals and artists who saw Greece as both the cradle of Western civilization and a contemporary symbol of freedom against the Ottomans. Lord Byron, the Romantic poet, became the most famous of the European Greek lovers in 1823. He travelled to Greece using over £4,000 of his own money to fund the war effort and attempting to mediate between rival Greek factions. He died in Missolonghi on the 19th of April in 1824 of a fever, becoming a martyr for the cause. Now, he'd actually left England with said fever, having been advised essentially not to go up and down stairs in his own house, and he thought, great, my doctor suggested I shouldn't go up to the second floor. I will now travel to Greece. So he didn't really contribute anything in terms of any kind of physical element to the conflict, because as soon as he got there, he was in bed, and he then stayed in bed until he ceased to be. But his death rallied further international support, leading to decisive intervention by Britain, France, and Russia, and ultimately the recognition of Greek independence in 1830. Byron's involvement symbolised the fusion of romantic idealism and political activism, making the Greek cause a cornerstone of European liberalism.
This is the first half of the poem.
Yes,
on the second slide. We can read it together and discuss some of the themes of it, perhaps.
Would you like me to read it out?
If you would like to read it out, I can read it, whatever you prefer.
I don't mind. Do you want me to? I'll read this slide and you read the next one.
Yeah, sure.
Wonderful. The Isles of Greece, where burning Sappho loved and sung, where grew the arts of war and peace, where Delos rose and Phoebus sprung. Eternus summer gilds them yet, but all except their sun is set. The Scion and Tian muse, the hero's heart, the lover's lute, have found a fame your shores refuse. Their place of birth alone is mute to sounds which echo further west than your sire's islands of the blessed. The mountains look on Marathon, and Marathon looks on the sea, and musing there an hour alone, I dreamed that Greece might still be free. For standing on the Persian's grave, I could not deem myself a slave. A king sate on the rocky brow, which looks overborne Salamis, and ships by thousands lay below. Many nations all were his, he counted them at break of day, and when the sun set, where were they? And where are they? And where art thou, my country, on thy voiceless shore? The heroic lay is tuneless now, the heroic bosom beats no more, and must thy lyre, so long divine, degenerate into hands like mine? 'Tis something in the dearth of fame, though linked among a fettered race, to feel at least a patriot's shame, even as I sing, suffuse my face. For what is left the poet here? For Greece a blush, for Greece a tear? Must we weep over days more blessed? Must we blush our fathers bled? Earth render back from out thy breast a remnant of our Spartan dead. Of the 300 grant but 3, to make a new Thermopylae. What silent still and silent all? Ah no, the voices of the dead sound like a distant torrent's fall. And answer, let one living head but one arise. We come, but 'tis the living who are done. In vain strike other chords, fill high the cup with Samian wine, leave battles to the Turkish hordes, and shed the blood of Seir's vine. Hark, rising the ignoble call, how answers each bold battle.
Wonderful, indeed.
Wonderful. Jack?
Yeah. Do we want to discuss the first half, or
What do you think?
Shall I read on to the second?
Should we immerse ourselves in the whole poem?
Yeah. Next slide, please, Sam.
No, this is the next slide.
Oh, you're already
Yeah.
on, sorry. You have the Pyrrhic dance as yet. Where is the Pyrrhic phalanx gone? Of two such lessons, why forget the nobler and the manlier one? You had the letters Cadmus gave, think ye he meant them for a slave? Fill high the bowl with Samian wine, will not think of scenes like these. He made Anacreon's song divine. He served Polycrates, a tyrant, but our masters then were still at least our countrymen. The tyrant of the Chersonese was freedom's best and bravest friend. That tyrant was Miltiades. Oh, that present hour would lend another despot of the kind, such chains as his were sure to bind. Fill high the bowl with Samian wine. On Sully's rock and Parga's shore exist the remnants of a line such as the Doric mothers bore, and there, perhaps, some seed sown Heracleidan blood might own. Trust not for freedom to the Franks, they've a king who buys and sells in native swords and native ranks. The only hope of courage dwells, but Turkish force and Latin fraud would break your shield, however broad. Fill high the bowl with Samian wine. Our virgins dance beneath the shade, I see their glorious black eyes shine. But gazing on each glowing maid, my own eyes burning teardrop slaves. To think such breasts must suckle slaves. Place me on Sunium's marbled steep, where nothing save the waves and I may hear our mutual murmurs sweep. There, swan-like, let me sing and die. A land of slaves shall ne'er be mine. Dash down your cup of Samian wine. It's beautiful, this refrain of Samian wine. He must be very intoxicated at the end of this poem. I put some things in bold. The things I put in bold, they're all references to Herodotus' account of the Persian War, which is relevant because this is the war between Greece and Turkey, and 2,500 years ago was the war between Greece and Turkey, but it was Persia. So you have a lot of references to when the Greeks at critical points in that war, when all hope seemed lost because of the immensity of the Persian army in contrast with the Greeks, they somehow pushed them back. And in the Battle of Marathon, where that's Miltiades, then Thermopylae, what the film The 300 is about, the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, the mountain pass, and then you. Yeah, it's sorry, what kind of romanticism is this? How have it changed? What are the values?
Heroic.
Heroic, indeed. Revolutionary.
Mm-hmm.
Nationalist.
Independence.
Self-determination.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also an appeal to, there were good kings once.
Yeah.
Who held us together.
Right.
Through these terrible times.
Right.
A bit of a romantic look back on them.
If we were to consider, this is a poem about a revolution essentially, if we were to consider the American and the French Revolution, which would it be closer to, do you think?
The American, I would say.
And for what reason?
Because it feels like a rising up of people throwing off the chains of a foreign power, maybe?
One aspect, yes. And what are they restoring? Or what are they instituting? Maybe that's a slight difference, but in America...
I think it's wine, really, isn't it?
Sorry?
Wine.
Wine, indeed. And why do they reference all of this stuff about the Greek heritage?
Yeah. So it feels like they're trying to recover something from their own heritage.
Right.
I don't know the history well enough to know what they lost, and whether they were merely throwing off the chains of a foreign power or recovering something else. That's what it. feels like.
I mean, it's different to America in that sense, but this kind of form of civic nationalism is something we see from the 19th century through to the 20th century, possibly even the 21st, in the sense that you have an anchoring point. If you had a former state, you have an anchoring point to base your future vision of society on. So unlike Burke discussing France, where that wall is being knocked in its entirety down to its base level, you already have an anchoring in the sense that you had a vision of the state previous that has been taken over, warped, whatever, and that you're returning to. So for the Greeks, they're looking back to the time prior to occupation by the Ottomans and thinking, well, we have this anchoring point that we can then build our future on. You see this after the fall of the Soviet Union with the singing revolution in the Baltics that have an anchoring point in their past. The idea that you need to be able to build to somewhere, you have to have a vision of what you had and thereby where you're going, rather than just, as Burke would say, starting afresh in a kind of completely anarchic sense.
How long have they been under the Ottoman Empire?
Since probably the fall of Constantinople.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's around
So 1456,
Okay.
I want to say,
So-
roughly, 1453.
Yeah, it's about 4
So
centuries.
it's kind of anti-Burkean then, because Burke is saying, don't throw off the yoke of the king. This is saying throw off the yoke of the empire.
Indeed.
But after 1,000 years, it doesn't sound very Burkean at all to me. It sounds like Burke would say, well, actually, don't change it that quickly. Maybe just change the balance of power. And then think about America. There is no history in America of settlers having a previous nation or national identity, collective identity, except to the extent that they were Europeans.
But there are many
British.
But there are many conservatives during the 18th century, not so much Burke, but there are many conservatives who are writing histories of England that see the period that they're living through, 1730s, 1740s. They're really criticising this concept of the Norman yoke. So the idea that England had fallen under a corruption of the Roman ideal, and that England had been left with this kind of dilapidated architecture of a state, of a polity, left by Rome, and that during the Norman invasion, this was corrupted by a kind of continental sort of but very much. I mean, you see lots of writers talking about how the continent is far warped from Rome, whereas England had managed to maintain a certain element of this Roman tradition. But the Norman yoke has stifled that, and this period in the late 17th into the 18th century was a period at which that would be restored. So, although, as you say, completely rightly, America is not a fine example to parallel with it. England is an example where there's this idea that some kind of foreign power has come and occupied the land. But I would also say, I guess if you were going to use the American example, there would be elements of kind of like, well, the Pilgrims left, they didn't have an idea that England was going to become the overarching state in America, and now it's time to return to those original ideas of the Pilgrims, that it was going to be this state. So I'm sure there are ways of trying to link it to this, but certainly countries with anchoring points have a tendency to have this form of civic nationalism, that is that you have a history that's been stolen away from you, and obviously we see it in post-colonialism so much in terms of whether it be in India or in various other regions through Africa, and even up to today in Australia with the Commonwealth, we see these ideas that actually there are traditions that have been swept away by kind of imperial dominating power, and the civic nationalism arises up to try and restore a former sense of identity, I guess.
Yeah. I think what emerges from this discussion, maybe just bring it to a summary, and then we can talk a bit longer if people are willing to stay a bit. But romanticism seems to be concerned with nature, return to nature, but what that nature is, what that actually refers to, seems to vary
Very much
from country to country, from culture to culture, and that's partly because, well, if you're a very new country like America, what might that return mean? a return to what? Well, it would probably be something more like an original moral law, perhaps in the religion you carried overseas, which rather than in what actually existed in your nation, or maybe even the political heritage from the British, but reconstituted in light of the moral order.
Well, modern American discourse, it's always going back to the founding, the
Well,
founders.
indeed, and now they can do that. Indeed.
Yeah.
And so romanticism really does. There's purity in the original, but what is the original? The original state before the politics, the first state of the politics, the state of the politics before the revolution. Which revolution?
Yeah. Well, on that point I was just making, the Whigs in 1688 argue that it is the House of Orange that is restoring the prior to Norman yoke idea. Like the House of Orange is going to restore this Roman tradition. So another foreign power coming over is somehow going to restore Rome against this idea of a kind of Gallic sort of influence. So completely to the point you're making, Jack, it's very difficult to work out when these arguments start getting made about origin points, where that origin point actually lies, and everyone can use it for their own ends.
Why? Maybe it's an open question. Why does origin connote such reverence?
Well, I guess partly, Jack, because of the reason that we've held this series in such high esteem, which is that heritage is so important to the maintenance of a society, and looking back as far as one can go is sort of, well, it goes back. It's the owl of is it the golden thread, owl of Athena? This idea that, particularly in the West, that there's kind of a long legacy of kind of political and philosophical heritage that we have, and we should look back as far as we can to those kind of founding
your own romanticism.
Yeah.
I'm going to be a bit more cynical to say it's the people in power who use it. Is clearly an emotional tool, a romantic tool,
certainly,
that touches individuals, whether they know it or not, and it's something that people in power use as a tool to retain their power. And I think you can look at, I would call the hypocrisy of it when you compare, the founding story of modern America with the status of the first Americans.
Yes.
No, I
First
agree.
natives.
Or the slaves, of course.
Or the slaves, indeed. Yeah.
As Dr. Johnson, right? The loudest squeals of liberty come from the drivers of Negroes.
Which is very, very true.
There's something. But actually, if you read the Jamaican historian, a guy called Orlando Patterson, he actually talks about this dynamic, and it is the modern idea of liberty partly comes from this creation of a form of slavery, which is social death, and distinguishing oneself from that. It's why, for example, Spartans were so obsessed about liberty in ancient Greece. Most of our population is enslaved. When you have non-slave societies or societies where slaves intermarry with free people, you don't have this distinction, and the idea of serving someone isn't something which is shameful.
And I think that it's not as prominent in everyday life.
Well, no.
When you do have that distinction, it's more prominent that you understand your own liberty.
So this idea of wanting your liberty in a sense of freedom from this force, which is forcing you not to live in a way which is free. I mean, this becomes really important in European society at the same time when vast numbers of people from Africa are being systematically enslaved. And it's a creation of people who have a social status which didn't really exist much in Europe. I mean, okay, it might be some Roma people enslaved in, the Balkans or something, but there wasn't so much slavery within Europe beyond penal slavery, right? If you're a galley slave or something because you committed a crime, or perhaps because you're a prisoner of war or something, right? But there's this sense of freedom, this very sort of emotional sense of freedom that we cannot have, anyone above us. There is a sort of psychological link to that.
My old professor,
slavery,
Richard Watchmore, he's just written recently a book called The End of Enlightenment, and this is the idea of the sacralization of liberty as a concept, that by the end of the 18th century, you have liberty replacing the idea of God, the idea of a kind of moral driving factor for colonialism, or, to this political concept of we're bringing liberty, we're bringing modern ideas of the world, and this is a direct transferal from religion into a secular world, and liberty rises up onto the pedestal of God in the argument for sort of foreign intervention.
And I mean, I think the thing is, in the end, liberty in like the classical tradition, like if you look at someone like Aquinas, liberty is about the freedom to do what is right, to not be constrained. You know, you're not free if you're chained up and unable to do your duty. But that doesn't mean that you could still essentially be a slave in a way from a modern point of view and still be free, because if no one's stopping you doing the things which you need to do, your liberty isn't compromised.
Yeah.
Or if you choose the things you choose to do.
Well, it's not actually about the things you choose to do, because, well, you're trying to do the things which are good, right? So if you live on some farm and your duty in life is to work on this farm and to look after bring up your family and so on, and no one stops you getting on with that, the fact that you're not allowed to join the army, you're not allowed to move to the next farm along the road, that doesn't really infringe on your liberty in this classical understanding, because you don't have some sort of intrinsic right to that sort of liberty, right? Because there's obviously, you know, no one's got the freedom to become a king. I mean, there has to be a limit somewhere where you say, okay, someone's got a freedom to do this, to do that, to do another thing. But the idea was that the important constraint is that you need to have the freedom to do the things which you ought to do. Whereas in this Enlightenment thinking of liberty, liberty becomes, as you're saying, sort of sacralized. It becomes like this thing which people want as much as possible of.
Mm-hmm. But that actually aligns with your, so the old idea that you were born to a role, or you led a life that fitted into a society, and your role in that society was defined. So of course you couldn't become a king because you were born to you were born to someone who was never going to become a king. But society has changed, again through science and scientific ideas coming along, and the idea that we are free. We're bound by nature, but otherwise we are free to become whatever we want. The society has loosened up, and these opportunities have opened up. So actually now, I'm not sure. I wouldn't say it's become sacralized. I would say actually society has changed. It's become possible. So things that were not possible have become possible. And this is, I feel, with Hegel coming on here with Martin.
I don't know. I don't think there is a difference. Though. I mean, I think a lot of problems of modern conceptions of freedom is it's always about the freedom to be able to do something which you are not able by yourself to do. And that was always in the classical conception of freedom. It's always about freedom to do something which you yourself can do. You always should be free to do your duty, because that's something which pertains to you. But, there are freedoms which people talk about in the modern world.
Sort of abstracted.
For example, people talk about people having a right to healthcare, and that's also associated with a freedom. It's like, I'm not free if I'm not able to get treated. But that's not something which you can, it's not that you're claiming that, someone else, you're not claiming that no one can stop me from treating myself, which, I mean, from a classical point of view, yes, of course, no one should be able to stop someone from, doing something, medical to themselves if it's, it doesn't hurt another person, right? But from a modern point of view, it's like, no, someone else has to do this thing to me, and you have these sorts of, the problem with, I think this is a big difference between the classical ideas of freedom and the modern ideas of freedom, is that the classical idea of freedom is about, it's a subordinate value. It's good to be free, but it's not essential. The most important thing is to do what is right. And freedom is about being able to do what is right. Whereas in the modern world, freedom is what people want for its own sake.
People do what is wrong as well as right. They may choose to do the right, but they actually want the freedom to do wrong.
Exactly. They want the freedom to do things which are wrong, at least from a sort of absolute set of values. And of course, in the modern world, a lot of people don't have a sense that they are governed by an absolute set of values. So there's a sense of, I want to be able to do this because this is what I desire. Which is,
So society is doubly worse off compared to the classic view. First of all, because people want to be free to do what is wrong, and secondly, as you say, because society no longer has the controls, to put it that way, to ensure that you don't do what is wrong. And I'm thinking about my kids at this point, actually, funny enough. Want to stay out all night, and I can't do anything about it.
What could be said as well, going back to Jack's original question, now this is going to be beautiful, Jack. I hope you're impressed. What could be said, going back to origin points, is myths. Now, we've seen a myth of a religious state, a myth of a secular state, these ideas of liberty in both conceptions, in the sense of the kind of post-Enlightenment vision of liberty, but also kind of older world liberty. And when we look at the Romantic poets, we also have someone like Coleridge, who I think encapsulates what we've been discussing, the slaughtering of the albatross. This was an idea that the moral world was decaying, that, there was kind of a loss of these traditional values that we held dear, and obviously rituals and superstitions and these things, and a secular world was just going to slaughter the albatross. Coleridge was writing about a mariner, the rhyme of the ancient mariner, on a ship. And that ship could be said to be the ship of state. And there's a great scholar who writes about the ship of state, and that is Michael Oakeshott. And next week, we will be looking at Michael Oakeshott and Benjamin Disraeli, 2 weeks' time. And I do hope that you'll all be able to attend for this session on One Nation conservatism, what it is, the impact that it has today, because we still have a legacy of it today, and it's very potent throughout the centuries that proceed. And I hope you very much enjoyed this session on Burke and the Romantics. Wonderful. Thank you.
Every time I think you're going to say something deep.
It's just a segue.